Well, this one came so close for me, guys. So close. Unfortunately, it's still rotten, but it didn't have to be this way. I'm talking about Jack the Giant Slayer from 2013. It has a 53% on the tomato meter and a 55% on the audience score. 92,000 plus audience reviews. So close to that 60%, so close to not being rotten. And yeah, that's the way it felt for me too. I went into this and it took me a while to see why it should have been rotten. And it took me a while to realize that it wasn't going to improve, but it had all the stuff that it had all the stuff in place that you would think would make a good film, something that would be fresh. I don't know, it just didn't hit. I can explain exactly why I think it didn't hit. Um, it just needed some tweaks. It needed somebody to go over this. It felt like something that was rushed out, that if somebody had spent some time going over it and polishing it up a little bit in just some small ways, it would have really been a lot better. Um, we have a PG-13 movie that feels like it was written more in a way that would have worked as an R-rated film, and it suffered greatly for that. It either should have been written a little bit differently, or it should have been put out as an R-rated film and filmed a little bit differently. That's the big flaw for me. That's the big reason why a lot of it didn't quite work for me. But aside from that, it also has some visual fails in the logic department. We have Jack the Giant Slayer. Everybody knows this tale. I don't know the origins of it, but it goes way, way back. And the movie capitalizes on the fact that this tale, this fairy book, fairy story type of tale goes way, way back. Um, there's no reason why it couldn't have worked, as crazy as it is. The logic of it itself is that, there's going to be these magic beans that can produce a gigantic beanstalk that can go so high up in the sky, and it can take you up to what is like another world floating up there, another land mass where there are giants and etc. Well, this is a conceit that you can take as true in a fantasy, and in a fantasy you can allow yourself this one illogical thing to hinge everything else on, as long as you have everything else logically working within that. And unfortunately, there are other logical problems, though, aside from that. As a fantasy story, though, it had everything in place. It had CGI that was just fine. It had the budget into that was just fine. It had the proper cast. The cast wasn't the greatest in the world, but it wasn't bad, and the acting wasn't bad. With one exception, I think Ian McShane might have been miscast as the king, and his performance didn't ring real true to me. It felt like he should have played a more comic relief type king, and that's not what it was going for. But largely, I think the casting was fine. The acting was fine. It's just that, when this movie opens, you see this kingdom on Earth in some period. It could be the Middle Ages. It's some fantasy type period, and way back in ancient times, certainly in Europe. And certainly in Britain, because at the end of the film we're shown that this is straight up in Britain sometime in the ancient past. Now, you're seeing this castle, which, it's not completely, even by medieval standards, it's not right. You have this gigantic castle behind these castle walls, and around that castle is some kind of town in that castle keep, which is not the way things worked back then. You would have a castle like this, but outside of these castle walls, you would have your proper town with, your shops and your farmers going to market and etc. And then the castle inside would be where your military barracks were, and your royalty and your elites, so to speak. Well, in this, you just have a castle that's off, in a valley or up against the hillside, and it's got this road leading up to it. And when you first see it, there's a big problem for me here. Like, Jack is taking his horse to the market in this giant castle keep or town or whatever you want to call this. It's not accurate to anything historically, but again, it could work in like a fable. It could work in that regard. It's a kid's fairy tale. But anyway, on this road to market or on this road to the castle, there's no other traffic. At all points when you see this castle, you even see it in aerial shots. You see it from ground level, aerial shots, whatnot. There's never any other traffic going on the road to or from this castle that's supposed to have markets and all these people living there. That's the first big fail here. It's a visual plot problem, and I don't know if it's they didn't have the budget to show this, but if you show like this gigantic town or castle or whatever it is, and there's one road leading into it, you're going to have traffic on that road of all different types. But nope, this movie just has this almost like something taken out of The Wizard of Oz with the yellow brick road where there's no traffic on it at all except for our main character. That doesn't make any sense logically. That's the first thing that I wrote down because that stuck out to me right away. It's not explained why the villain in this, there's a villain character played by Stephen Tucci. He has been in a lot of different films. I most recently talked about his performance, his character in the Transformers franchise. He plays a villain in this, and it's never explained why he's this villain. Why is he doing all this bad stuff? Why does he betray the good guys? Why does he betray the king? Why does he want to team up with the giants and defeat the good guys? It's all stuff that could have worked, but we're never given enough setup on this, on why this villain's doing this stuff. That's a big problem. Like, the characters aren't set up. Even the good guys, they're set up enough to work as good guys, but don't put too much thought into it because you don't get an idea on how they got to where they are in the film. You get the king. Well, what's the background on this king? You get the king's daughter. Okay, what makes her the way she is? You get Ewan McGregor is playing this knight character that's the right-hand man of the king, or he's the representative of the king's armed forces. What makes him who he is? The movie just doesn't explain any of this. These characters needed to be set up better, but the big fail is the villain. If the villain had been set up properly, we get some idea why he's doing these things. Then the other characters, the problems they had, they wouldn't have been as noticeable. It was just mainly that the villain wasn't set up. He was just a cardboard villain. The logic on him just completely fails. And why didn't the villain use these magic beans before? Like, the beginning of this movie shows you that these magic beans that can make this beanstalk, they're in possession of the villain the whole time, as is another plot device, this ancient king's crown that you need to control the giants. The two main plot devices that you need to accomplish the villain's tasks, the villain already possessed these things from the very start of the film, yet it doesn't explain why the villain didn't use these things before. He just decided to wait until this movie was filmed to decide to do all these things, to carry out his plan. Why did he just sit around and he had all the stuff he needed to do this before? Why didn't he do it before? Unexplained, because the villain wasn't set up, and that's just the main fail here. But let's get into the audience reviews. Why does the audience think this deserves to be rotten? Is it for the same reasons I do? I told you mine. I say it's largely that the villain's not set up properly. It's largely that it was written like an R-rated film and it didn't work because it only had a PG-13 rating to work with. So anyway, let's get into this. I'm not going to look at any reviews or read reviews that are above 3 stars because that's not going to help our cause here. So 1 star, July 27, 2019. It is an old school heroism movie starring cheap romance and an extremely flat plot. It's more disappointing than boring though. Yeah, it's not boring, and I'll agree it is disappointing because it had all the stuff it needed and yet it just didn't do it effectively. 1 star, well, if I had to put my star rating, I'll say, yeah, 1 star. 1 star because for me it is also very disappointing. Let's move down. 2.5 stars, June 23rd, 2018. We're already back over a year ago. Year and a half ago. That's because largely this film has been forgotten. It is showing up here and there on paid cable channels and whatnot, but I even forgot about this. I was only reminded of it because it showed up on one of the channels I have on DirecTV. Otherwise, I would have forgotten about this too. 2.5 stars, not that good. Overblown CGI and chaos, chaos, chaos at the end. Black. Yeah, I think what they're talking about is that the big battle at the end of this is a whole lot of giants fighting a whole lot of the king's soldiers, and you don't see anything that's, epic. You don't see anything that you haven't seen before in 1,000 other movies in different situations. And the CGI, it's all CGI. Now, the CGI works. It doesn't have obvious flaws. It's not off-putting. It doesn't look cheap. But however, there's just so much of it that you're just left with the feeling that what you're watching isn't real. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't have any epicness or excitingness to it because it's just all CGI, like 90-something% of it is. And even though it's good, it just doesn't feel real. And yeah, that's a fail. 1 star, May 27, 2018. I thought it would be a good movie, but apparently it was not to my standards. Yeah, I thought it would be good too. I couldn't find anything obviously wrong with it until, we got 20, 30 minutes in, and then I'm like, yeah, I could see right away that some of the stuff was set up to work in something that would be more gory and graphic, and it could be done visually in a more exciting way. But it couldn't, and it didn't work, and it wasn't effective because we were stuck with a PG-13 where you couldn't do what it was written to really want to do. And that was the same with that epic battle at the end with all this CGI going on. It didn't feel real, not only because it was all CGI, but also because it couldn't actually show you the results of all the stuff going on. Like, you could see people getting hit and knocked around, but you couldn't feel it because you couldn't see blood, you couldn't feel gore, you couldn't get language. So, it felt like something that had to be written differently to work because you only had PG-13 limitations on it, and yet this was straight up written. It could have worked with an R rating, but it just felt very unbelievable the way it was. 2.5 stars, January 28, 2018. We're back 2 years now. I would say it's a fairy tale story. It's basically like Jack and the Giant Beanstalk. Jack will have to face some people and fight. Yeah, but it didn't give us anything beyond what we've seen many times in this tale. This tale is very familiar. The only thing that was different about this is at the very end of the film, we're taken into modern day London, where it is shown that all of this stuff really happened. It happened in Britain, and it straight up relates to the modern day monarchy and the modern day display of the crown jewels. So that was the only thing that took it in a different direction for me. All the other stuff we've seen so many times before in different types of material. 3 stars, October 14, 2017. Not English, but we're back in 2017 now. 2 stars, November 9th, 2016. So we're back more than 3 years now, back in time. Bryan Singer, the man who gave us the X-Men movies and The Usual Suspects, now gives us a new take on a classic fairy tale we all have been dying to see. Well, not really. Don't get me wrong, I am really looking forward to the new Disney Beauty and the Beast remake, but I don't sincerely care about this tale. As I expected, this movie didn't spin the wheel for me. The characters are meh, the story is bad, and the effects are very underwhelming. Yeah, it's like I wasn't really a fan of this fairy tale either. It's one of the forgettable ones to me, but I went into it with an open mind, and this could have really been something if some flaws were fixed, but it's largely just been forgotten about but on its own, it doesn't have that type of want-to-see appeal. So 2.5 stars, August 23rd, 2016. Entertaining enough for the type of movie it was. Nothing too extraordinary. Well, maybe if you're 10 or 12 years old or 13, this had some value, but as an adult, it just felt very disappointing. 3 stars, August 18, 2016. It's not as bad as it could have been, but it's definitely not as good as it could have been either. Think of it as Lord of the Rings light. What took me away from the story was the overuse of special effects and CGI and obvious use of green screen. The acting is decent and the movie moves at a good pace. It's watchable and has decent amount of action. It gets better towards the end and it's an okay movie to watch on a rainy day. Yeah, and especially if you're 12 or 13, but as an adult, not 3 stars. I'm just going to say 1 star because it doesn't work enough to be higher than 1 star. 1 star, July 17, 2016. It's a very stupid film. Well, yeah, it comes across like that because if it had had an R rating, it would have been so much more visually believable and it would have worked. It would have felt more impactful. It still would have been stupid. It is a fairy tale, but with just the PG-13 trying to do R-rated type stuff, but then showing it in a PG-13 way, just makes everything so obviously flawed. Let's see. Who else agrees with me here? 2.5 stars. Didn't care for this. Only Bryan Singer pick I don't like. And as I've said before, I don't know what others like. I only know what I like. Well, reviewers are bringing up that, they don't usually find themselves disappointed by a Bryan Singer directed film. And that's largely the X-Men, right? Superhero material. Yeah, all of the X-Men films are more exciting than this because this just didn't bring anything new to the table. Maybe if you're a kid, like I said, maybe if you're 12, this works. 1.5 stars, September 12, 2015. So, wow, we're quite a ways back in time, more than 4 years. There is no doubt Bryan Singer is a fantastic director, and noticeably the project was shot out of love to cinema, which makes hating the movie hard. The campy dialogue would make Joel Schumacher blush. The pacing is uneven, and let's not get started on the overly cartoony CGI. Perhaps the film could have been more successful as a straight-to-DVD animated movie. Yeah, I'll agree largely with that. This could have succeeded as a PG animated film, or it could have gone R-rated and succeeded as an R-rated film. But it's like in a no man's land of PG-13 where it's just too obvious to rip it apart, and the dialogue doesn't work. I said before the acting's not bad. Well, the acting's not bad, but there is dialogue that just doesn't work. What did I write down? Well, yeah, a lot of it's this two-headed giant. There's a two-headed giant that you can't quite tell if it's supposed to be comic relief or it's supposed to be gross and scary. That's a failing of the rating of the film, and it's also a failing. It should have either gone for a straight up kids lighthearted comedy, or it should have gone in an R-rated direction. But there's this two-headed giant that's like, at times it's supposed to be gross and scary, at times it's supposed to be goofy and comical, and it's just weird. And there's some lines of dialogue between the characters and the giants that are goofy and weird. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. That's my noticeable fail on the Giants, was that two-headed giant. The movie couldn't make up if that was supposed to be gross or if it was supposed to be comedy. It really couldn't make up its mind. 3 stars. Jack the Giant Slayer is a nice film based on Jack and the Beanstalk story. This movie is fairly put together with your basic comedy and adventure for the youth. All in all, a decent family film. Well, that's where I'm going to stop and say that's why it failed, because it was still written too much like an R-rated film with stuff in it that should have been done in an R-rated film. But yeah, it also had that kind of action-adventure comedy that you would want in a kid's story. It doesn't work together like that, Make up your mind. Is this PG-13 or is it R-rated? Or is it supposed to be a G-rated animated show? I mean, it just couldn't make up its mind. But I'll read on. For the most part, the graphics were good. The acting was fair for the cast, which was selected. And of course, what script was provided to make a story. For the biggest part of the film, which caught my attention the most, was size proportions. In many instances, when the giants and the humans were up close, that's debatable. Like, the giants were different sizes, the humans were different sizes. I don't think there was a scale problem there, if that's where this reviewer was going. It worked for me visually in that way. 2 stars. July of 2015. Though not the most particularly fond of fairy tales, with Bryan Singer directing Jack the Giant Slayer, I felt like there was promise of a good visual spectacle, capitalizing on the recent trend of recycling fairy tale stories and spending huge amounts of money on them. Jack the Giant Slayer has little room for surprises. The story of Jack and the Beanstalk is one which has been told countless times, be it through TV specials or the librarian at primary school. Yeah, that's part of the problem. This movie needed to step up the game. In my opinion, it should have been an R-rated movie. It should have made it more of a dark thing. It should have gone more into horror. It shouldn't have been a family fun thing. It should have switched it up, you know. It should have been an R-rated film. That's my opinion. That's where I would have wanted to see this go, but it didn't do that. So again, that's like we've seen this. This reviewer's right. We've seen this done too many times. Everybody knows this. We know the PG and G-rated version of this. Nothing new there. 2 stars, July 24, 2015. Feels like you are watching one of those movies on the Sci-Fi Channel. Not very good. Kind of, but the budget was a little too high. The CGI was a little too effective to be a sci-fi, straight to sci-fi flick. 2.5 stars. Neither adds nor diminishes value to the origin story it is trying to retell. Jack the Giant Slayer may have acquired a few fun moments courtesy of Ewan McGregor and Nicholas Hoult, but its overuse of CGI and weak storytelling derailed it from being fully enjoyable. Yeah, and I'll say the romance story between the common peasant boy, Jack, and the king's daughter, they want to do some kind of romance, but you know what? It just doesn't work because we're in PG-13. And it almost felt like it was stuck closer to PG than PG-13 on that romance story. Again, I'm saying if this had been R-rated, it would have been more effective. But the romance, it just doesn't work. Again, are you for kids or are you for adults? Where are you on this? It's like it's a whole lot of stuff mixed up. 2 stars, June 2nd, 2015, a giant-sized misfire. It had the cast, the crew, and the budget to pull off a fun fairy tale spectacle, but only one word sums up the final result: lackluster. Just about everything about this film was so uninspired, dull, and lifeless on screen, from the cosplay level of costumes to the humorless approach. The plot never took any interesting turns, and any time you'd think something interesting was going to happen, the story would retreat back to mediocrity. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. It should have gone with an R-rated direction. It wouldn't have had to retreat back to a boring fairy tale, lackluster boring fairy tale story. I agree with this reviewer. And it's like he says, the problem isn't that it's a bad movie per se. It isn't. Yeah, it's not a bad movie. It's just, it just should have gone, it should have picked a direction and gone there. It should have gone R-rated, in my opinion. 2.5 stars, May 10th, 2015. Fun, lighthearted, but too much CGI and lightweight story to work with. Good supporting role from Ewan McGregor. Yeah, McGregor didn't do bad. But you know what was weird about him? I even wrote it down because it just felt a little weird to me. His hair. Like, I don't know if he's wearing a hairpiece, if he does wear a hairpiece, and I don't know if he's wearing one in this film, but it felt like he was, and it felt a little too goofy, and his hair was a little too goofy, like something that you would think would be in an action comedy. It was hard to take him seriously as some kind of knight character doing what should have been brutal R-rated things, but then seeing him with this goofy hair, and it looked like a hairpiece. I don't know if it was, but it just, I had to write it down because it didn't work for me at all. But let's move on. 2.5 stars via mobile, April 2015. Well, congratulations. You know how to operate your mobile device to put some stars there. Big deal. Big deal. 3 stars, entertaining enough despite some pretty horrendous CGI. No, the CGI wasn't bad. I don't know why people say that. I've seen this once or twice. They're complaining about the CGI. I don't think it was at all. I think it's just that we didn't see anything new. And it showed us giants that weren't bad looking at all, CGI-wise, but they weren't convincing as giants to me because it had to do it in a PG way for kids. That's not going to work, really. It isn't. That's the fail to me. The CGI on its own looked perfectly fine to me. Half a star, April 27, 2015. I like epic fantasy adventures. I really do. I especially like epic fantasy adventures with action in them. I really do. I really like epic fantasy adventures with witty heroes in them. I honestly, truly do. Jack the Giant Slayer has all of this. Jack the Giant Slayer is a bad movie. Well, thanks, but you didn't tell us why it was bad. You just said it had epic stuff in it. Well, I've said what I wanted to say on it. 2.5 stars, April 2015. Another big budget redoing of a classic story with a weird new twist that just starts to bore more and more as the film goes on. Yeah, why didn't it go R-rated? Why didn't it show us like what it should have? It wasn't a weird new twist at the beginning, really. It was just a little bit contrived how Jack got the magic beans. I'll say it's a plot fail, whereas not only is it unexplained why the villain has all that he needs to do what he does, but doesn't do it until now. That's a plot fail. But also there's a plot fail where, okay, this monk thief character steals these magic beans from the villain, and he ends up giving them to Jack because he wants to escape on Jack's horse. But it's already shown that the castle keep has been locked down. There's no way to escape by horse yet. Somehow he's desperate to get a horse. I'm sorry, but that makes no sense. Another thing that makes no sense along in the same part of the story is, when the bad guy discovers that his magic beans have been stolen, he says to a henchman or to a guard, well, tell the guards to lock down the castle, to close the gates. And then the guards are able to close the gates long ways away on the other side of the castle. They're able to lock it all down before the bad guy can actually get to the gates. Well, that's not exactly possible. In the modern day, we have cell phones and wireless comms and telephones and whatnot. But no, you're back in the fantasy days. They would have to. This person that was told to lock down the gates would have had to have run down there and actually told the guards, or told somebody else that would in turn run down and tell the guards to lower the gate, or send up some signal in the courtyard for the guards to lower the gate. This could not have happened faster than the thief got there, considering that the thief left ahead of them. It's impossible. It's a fail, and it's just bad writing. But it's not the movie's biggest flaw. It doesn't ruin the film. It could have had this type of stuff in it several times, and it still wouldn't have killed the film or made it rotten. I've already said why the film deserves to be rotten, and it's not these plot flaws, but that is a big plot flaw that I found in it, and I wrote it down on my list. And I don't have that big of a list. My list is I've got like 10 different lines on my list. On a typical movie, I'll have like 25, 30 lines of problems. I've got only 10 on this. Only 3 are plot problems. The biggest one being just, why didn't the villain do what he did before? He had all the stuff to do it. No reason. But, most of the stuff on my list isn't even a plot problem. The two-headed giant, it just didn't work. Was it comedy? Was it horror? I don't know. It didn't make up its mind. Surviving the fall. The heroes survive the fall. The beanstalk is cut, and the heroes ride the beanstalk down to the ground from quite an altitude. And they have very contrived ways in which they survive the fall. I'm sorry, it's completely ridiculous. What they should have gone with is some kind of magic that would have helped them survive the fall. There are a lot of ways you could have done this in a logical way that would have worked within the story setting, why they could have survived the fall. But the movie chose the most illogical way to survive the fall, just saying that they basically braced themselves. That's how they survived. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. If that were the case, paratroopers wouldn't need parachutes when they jumped out of planes. They could just brace themselves and learn how to tuck and roll, and they wouldn't need those parachutes. That's a problem. It's not the fatal flaw of the film, but it is a problem. And what else on my... something else on my list that's not a problem, but it should have been dealt with, because this movie has quite a runtime. It has a 114-minute runtime. You had time to explain just how the giants got isolated up there in their giant world. The giants were shown to have blacksmithing skills and cooking skills, and they had English language and all this. How did this come to be exactly? The giants weren't like some cannibalistic creatures just living up there that weren't related to humans at all. They were pretty much like giant humans that were nasty. So how did they come to be like this? The movie had plenty of runtime to explain this, but it didn't, and that's another reason why it doesn't work. It is a problem with why the film deserves to be rotten. It's not a plot hole per se, but it's something that should have been explained and it isn't. And that's basically it for me. I've said my piece on what's wrong with this. I can go through another page of these and find out who might agree with some of that. Half a star, April 5th, 2015. It had great actors, but that's all I remember what is good. The movie itself is very trash, taking the piss out of Jack and the Beanstalk, and they chose to add more and more giants. 3 out of 10. 3 stars. Stop me if you've heard this one before. When Jack goes to market to try and sell his horse and cart, he returns with only beans, which angers his uncle to no end. So much so that he decides to talk all the way to town to sell what he can, or walk all the way town. I don't need a plot synopsis, sorry. We know the story. And yes, I did stop you, as you suggested. 3 stars, watched with my fiance, little nephew, how nice. 2.5 stars, it's visually impressive, but lackluster in terms of creating any semblance of a memorable story. Yeah, there's nothing new here. We know this story. Why do we need to see it just retold again? We need something new. 3 stars, Jack the Giant Slayer doesn't have much to offer in the post-Lord of the Rings movie world. Fortunately, the movie recognizes that and doesn't overstay its welcome by pretending it's something it's not, while what little it does have is decently good and entertaining. Relax and enjoy. Yeah, you can relax and enjoy. It's not a bad movie. I'm not saying it's a bad movie. I'm saying it is deserving to be rotten. It just doesn't quite get out of rotten territory, but it is not totally unenjoyable. You can watch this and enjoy it, particularly if you've got 12-year-old kids, maybe 8-year-old kids. They might enjoy this, but it is still a rotten film. 2.5 stars. Not bad, but could have been better without the bland Nicholas Hoult in the leading role. Yeah, I don't think he was bland, though. It wasn't him. It wasn't him as an actor, and it wasn't his performance. It was just like the dialogue. It couldn't do much with a PG-13 movie. Again, I say if it had been R-rated, this could have been so much more. 2 stars, January 31, 2015. This is 5 years ago. The movie should be called Jack the Giant Boar. Waste of a movie with a forgettable cast of characters. Yeah, it is a forgettable cast of characters only because that's the way they were written, not because of the actors doing bad jobs or anything like that. CGI was fine. The CGI is just like, I guess it's disappointing because it just shows you that they had all the stuff they needed to make it good, but they just did it in a way that was just not exciting, not compelling, and not memorable. 55% on the audience score. I agree with that. It deserves to be so close to not rotten, but it just doesn't get there. 55% is completely fair. 53% on the tomato meter. I actually think that's fair in this case as well. And I'm not recommending you watch this, but I'm not trying to say that you should avoid it. It is passable if you've got young kids, and I will see you again on the next episode of Rotten Reviews.